We're delighted to have Guillaume Gruere with us. He's a senior policy analyst with Natural Resources Policy Division, Trade and Agricultural Directorate at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in Paris. And he leads OECD's policy work on agriculture and water since 2013. He's recently published a report, Drying Wells and Raising Stakes, on the management of groundwater use in agriculture in OECD countries, based on a comprehensive international survey of groundwater management instruments that he's going to talk to us about today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizer for inviting me and giving us an opportunity to present the work of OECD. So, as David mentioned, I'm going to talk about recent work we've done on policy instruments to manage groundwater use in agriculture. So I'll focus mostly on quantitative side here. We wish we could do more on quality, but we start with quantity. And it was great to know that this was basically the first report that OECD ever published specifically on groundwater. So it was a little achievement for us, but it's just the beginning of what we should do. So to start with, what is OECD, you might wonder. For some of you that don't know, so this is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, based in Paris. It's an international organization with 34 member countries. So you see them in dark blue here. So we have North American countries. We have a lot of European countries, Turkey, Israel, Chile as well, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan and Korea. So it's a large set of different types of countries that tend to be developed countries in general, but that have similarities and differences. And what we do is we analyze policy, get data from those countries, and try to get to comparison. And half of what we do is write report, the other half is bring those results to a discussion table. So you have people for all those countries around the table, and they discuss what one country does compared to another one, and they get something out of the discussion. So the report I want to talk about today was actually published at the end of last year, released actually at UC Davis in October 2015. And it talks about different types of aspects that David mentioned. Is based on a comprehensive survey of management instruments in the countries that we look at. So it actually benefited a lot from contribution, in particular from our U.S. counterparts, from USDA in particular, that took a lot of time to fill our questionnaire, but also other countries. And so what I want to talk about is 3 points today. First, give you a very rapid overview of what is the status of agriculture groundwater use and the challenges in OECD countries. Second, what policies exist and are employed to manage groundwater use in agriculture today. And third, what are the conclusions of this report, which combine a lot of economic analysis, literature review of success and failure. Is there any way we can look at, policy packages that could help moving forward? So, the status of agriculture groundwater use, basically, as you might expect, it's a key asset for agriculture in semi-arid regions of those countries. The total estimate we try to get from the countries as of 2010 was around 123.5 cubic kilometer per year. So that's as of 2010. We don't have more recent data. And irrigated area by groundwater is around 23 million hectares. So to give you a better impression of it compared to other countries internationally, so India is way bigger than all the 34 countries in terms of groundwater use and agriculture groundwater use. And China is lower. But of course, bringing those countries together is a bit artificial. So, but you still see on this the dark bar is the agriculture versus the other uses. In OECD, it's about 56% of groundwater use for agriculture. It's similar to China, but much lower than those countries in South Asia, of course, that use more on agriculture. When you get into the country decomposition of groundwater use, so this is actually irrigation, so it's a bit lower than agriculture groundwater use as a whole. United States is over half of it. Then we have Mexico and a lot of southern European countries, Turkey, Italy, Spain, Greece, and then you have also Japan, Korea, Australia, that have a little bit of, some significant number of significant use of groundwater for agriculture. So I'm going to talk mostly about those countries. In the report, we also explain, we try to get data from the literature on the benefits of groundwater for the farmers. They, of course, find it very popular. It's an asset that they want to preserve, not only against natural climate variability, but also because it's water that you can use on demand, because it's usually higher quality water, although it might change. So there's a lot of different aspects to that. In terms of trend, we find an increasing trend in some of the leading groundwater using countries. Of course, there was a very high rapid acceleration of use in the 20th century, and now the acceleration is decreasing, so a slower pace, I would say, in those countries. Here you have the countries where we had time series data available, so 1990 and 2010. When you look at national official data in those countries, even though they have developed lots of time series that are very, very sketchy. They have like 3 years and then 9 years of nothing, and then 2 years and then 1 year, and you don't know where it's come. All the data at the government level is is not always looking good. It's not very continuous in many of those countries. So this increase that I show on the left-hand side, you don't see it very well, unfortunately. U.S. is the white bar. It's supposed to be pink. But it's driven by Turkey, that increased by around 300% from 1990 to 2010, and Greece as well. But of the top 10, you see on the right-hand side, that's visible, that 5 of the top 10 have increased use a little bit, or at least a lot in some of those. And then Japan is the only country that has actually decreased groundwater use in agriculture steadily from the 1990 to 2010. Of course, one of the consequences of some of the more regional use is that intensive use created, groundwater overdraft. We've heard so much about that in the last couple of days, and also led to some significant negative externalities at the regional level. So here is results from our questionnaire on some of the problems that are faced in regions that were surveyed. So when we started this questionnaire, we asked countries to provide data at the national level on policies, but also on a voluntary basis to provide more data at the subnational level, so what we call regions here. And some did, so we had data on 20 regions in 12 countries. They're listed below. And so in those regions, we asked, what are the main constraints you face? Are they major or minor? So major in blue here. And so you can see a list of different types of constraints that they face, from well yield reduction to salinity and land subsidence. What I can say from this graph is that each of those challenges is appearing in at least 20% of our little pool. It's not a huge pool of data, but it's still interesting to see that basically challenges are spread out in many regions around the world in the countries we looked at. So what do you do with that? So that's the core of the report. We started by discussing, using the economic literature as a background, what is the role of policy basically in managing groundwater use when you have those challenges in particular. So it was a chapter actually drafted by Nick Brozovic, who is in the room. So we relied on his expertise, and we started by discussing, there's discussion in the economics literature about whether management is always useful or not. We argue here that when there are long-term depletion and or negative externalities, there is a real clear role for policies. But then what policies is the second question. It's much more complex. So we looked at a very large panel of types of policies on the demand side in particular. This is a very simplified table. In the report, there's many more types of instruments we look at. And so we try to look at, what is the advantages and drawbacks of using each of these instruments from an economic perspective, and the conditions for success. And so for instance, in this table, regulatory instruments, some of them that we look at, we call entitlement. Some countries it's permit-based types of policies, or rights, groundwater rights. There are quotas, quantifications, quantitative restrictions, zoning, well spacing, etc. That's the first row. Some of those are really good for controlling use effectively. Some of them, there are costs, there are issues of how do you allocate quotas, there are issues of enforcement. And of course, the design is critical, and you need expertise and flexibility. So it doesn't work in all contexts, and that's basically the same message we have for all the different instruments that we categorize as economic also and collective action based here. On the supply side, we also look at, what about adding or storing water? Again, you find a lot of different options. I list some of them here in terms of, what types of things you can do. We heard so much about recharge types of instruments here and in this conference, so these are embedded there, some of them at least. But there are also surface water-based types of instruments. There are some of them are costly, but they can also be effective. they relieve the constraints. The main difference that we discuss, and it's not surprising to many of you, I guess, but is that when you focus on demand side, you try to optimize the problem as it is to change the behavior of the users. So hopefully it can replicate in the future. When you move on the supply side, in many cases, you basically move the constraint away rather than solving the problem. So it might come back in the future if you add more water to the problem. Then you might have farmers using more water as well. So we sort of argue for demand side instruments as before moving to supply side instruments. Moving to the results of the survey on which instruments are actually used in OECD countries. The main results that we have, of course, with limited time, I won't talk about all of them, but it's typical graphs like that where we show the blue bar here is at the national level and the other bars are at the regional level. It's the number of response that said they had those instruments. Here is the regulation as an example. You have regulation on the approval of new wells, groundwater withdrawal restriction, mandatory metering, regulation on the expansion of irrigated land. And if you look at the same on the economics side or on the collective action side, you have similar pattern, which means that they're relatively flat. You don't find in each category of instruments, I think we looked at around 50 or so instruments that are favored by all the regions or country. They actually better use each of them a different set of instruments. So it's very difficult to get many conclusion from it in the sense that maybe each of them has some merit, of course, as we said before. But what can we get out of that? And I have a little text here that shows that also legal systems differ widely across the countries and regions. Another way of looking at it, a little bit more complex and hard to see maybe, it's using this kind of spider web diagrams. So here are all the 20 regions that we looked at. They are around this spider web. So you see 4 regions of the US, so the southern High Plains Aquifer, the northern High Plains Aquifer, the Mountains Pacific West, and the Mississippi Alluvial Aquifer, and so on and so forth. You have Netherlands, Japan, and so on. And the lines in the middle that are all going in different directions represent standardized indices of the use of different types of approaches, so economic approaches, regulatory approaches, etc., and so forth. And so the black line, as an example, is what we call other types of controls. So these are not the typical instruments that control groundwater, but other types of controls that could affect groundwater. So on land, for instance, and so on and so forth. So the black line shows that in some regions it's more used because it's further from the center. So that's the one on the lower right hand. So it's the Spanish region and the Portugal one, also in France, but not so much in other regions, and so on and so forth. So you don't find many clear pattern, except maybe that in some countries that are not federally governed, of course you have similar types of regulation in the different regions. When we saw this diversity, then you wonder, is it really because there are different groundwater system and groundwater constraints? Of course, maybe we know that every aquifer system is different, so it might make sense to use a different set of instruments. So we only have 20 regions, so we can't do a huge comprehensive study, and we can't look at effectiveness because we have only cross-section data. We don't have time series. So all what we do in this book, I think, would call for more research to make it more comprehensive and get more learning from comparison of instruments. But what we can do is more qualitative maybe, or semi-qualitative, comparison and correlation, pairwise correlation across the indexes that we built. And we find that regions that exercise sort of less control in groundwater tend to be those that have higher use and more demand outside of the ag sector as well. Is it causality or not? We can't argue, but it could be. Economic and supply side approaches are more used in regions with high groundwater stress, so that makes some sense in my view. But overall, we don't find any specific correlation between the scope of management, so the involvement of government in terms of putting more and more types of instruments, and the importance of what we call groundwater stresses, being not only the fact that there could be overdraft, but also climatic stresses, no surface water available, and so on and so forth, high demand by other sectors. So here on the horizontal axis, you have this stress that I just mentioned, relative agroclimatic and other groundwater stress. Again, it's sort of a standardized index, so it's to compare regions. And on the vertical axis, you have the relative importance of public management approaches. And so, the little bullets here, the points here are the regions. So on the extreme right upright, you have the Israel Western Galilee, ISR, and you have the Mexican region, Laguna. So these are those two regions that have the most stress in our pool, but they tend to also have a large number of instruments. Doesn't mean they're effective, but so there's some kind of a balance in a way. On the other extreme, you have the Mississippi alluvial aquifers, some of the Portugal and Japanese types of system where you have fewer types of regulation that can be effective, apparently because Japan, reduced their use, but also that face lower stress. However, you also have regions with lower stress and high number of different types of instruments in Europe, and you have also regions with high stress, including the mountain and Pacific West, which includes California. Of course, it was before 2014, but also has low types of management, and the southern high plains aquifer is similar. Now, to finish with my last part, what do we get out of all this analysis? And we did not only look at economic literature, but we also looked at the success and failures that were found in the countries that we looked at in the literature. So we probably reviewed around 300 papers, and many of you maybe were authors of those papers. So thank you for giving us all the food for thought. And so we get to, it's very difficult to get some kind of a consistent framework knowing that you're at the international level and that aquifer systems are so locally specific. But still, talking to different people, we thought we found some kind of general rules or guidelines that could be useful in many situations and adaptable. The first thing we find is sort of it's a three-tier package. For all groundwater irrigation system, we think that things work better for management if you have those general conditions. First, a robust deformation system. Turns out that in lots of the regions we look at, there's not much data that is available to the policymaker. Maybe it's available in the scientist lab, but it's not really put together in different agencies. They don't talk to each other, so nobody really knows what's happening in terms of use, recharge, etc. So as surprising as it looks, it's actually happening. Use groundwater conjunctively as much as possible. It's very easy to say, of course, but it's essential to the system working. Think about it, at least, when you put together your management schemes. Favor the use of direct approach rather than going to very indirect ways of controlling groundwater. It's better to look at the use itself. Favor demand-side instrument, I mentioned that before. Enforce existing regulations. Lots of countries, especially in the Mediterranean, have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of illegal wells. So if you try to control the use from the wells that are official, then you're missing the point because they're going to still continue to use it in some other places. And remove purpose incentive. A lot of agriculture policies still sort of support options that are very water intensive. And in some cases, there's also energy types of subsidies in Mexico and India in particular that are still there and creates a lot more incentive to use and overuse groundwater. In regions with intensive groundwater use that face those long-term overdraft and or the negative externalities, we have what we call a tripod approach, which means we think it's better to have a combination of instruments, not just one. If you put off one of those pots, then it will fall. So you need to have a backbone of regulation system. You need to have some kind of components, types of economic instruments, and it's on purpose. This is very vague because then you can choose the types of instruments that seems to more adaptable in your situation. And then the collective management, meaning you want to involve the local stakeholders and to take into account the local specificities. Turns out that this little graph that we had, we thought about it before the sigma went out, but turns out that sort of fits a little bit. Not to say that it's perfect fit, but there is a bit of each of element maybe in the sigma in some of the regions that will develop in the future. And lastly, when you have really high stress, then you also, of course, just like in Central California, you also want to look at agronomic tools. Supply side instruments, of course, are essential in that case. So I have just 2 slides to finish. One is just to say that few of the survey countries apply these recommendations. They may not be perfect, as I said, but it's interesting to see that the 6 general conditions that seems pretty essential to us, at least, have not been applied at the national or even regional level that much. As I said, there's not much information. Lots of countries still have policies that push in the other directions. So there is efforts to be done. The tripod combination doesn't have to be used everywhere, just like the other controls, but it's like 30% of the countries use those. And in the region that are most stressed, this is the sentence down there, 65% of the most stressed region do not really report all the essential data. 80% do not use this tripod combination of approach. So in our view, less effective. So here are the main takeouts of my presentation. Number one, groundwater is an increasingly important resource for irrigated agriculture, including in OECD countries. We think it's a great asset that we need to preserve, and so that's why management is needed, because we don't want to let it go down. It's going to be super important in the future with climate change in particular. Intensive groundwater pumping of course, has negative impacts, including on farmers, other users, and the environment. So it's a serious problem in some regions. Governments should therefore especially improve information system and apply a combination of management approach that I mentioned to tackle these challenges. We think that the stakes are rising. Action should be taken now to mitigate future problems. What I mean by that is that some of the countries we work with, they don't irrigate much with groundwater, but we see that coming in the future. In the next 10 or 15 years, the southern France, for instance, there will be probably more groundwater irrigation. So if they don't look at it now and just let it go, and after that react and manage, then you might be in some problem as well. So this is the reference of the report, and we did publish profiles, so little briefs of the policies in each country, 16 countries. It's on the web, so if you're interested. And I left some copies of the report outside. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. We'll take a couple of minutes for questions here. Let's start right up the front.
Thanks for your presentation. It was a nice talk. I was somewhere halfway. I was a little bit shocked by one of your plots stating subsidence as a minor problem. I'm from the Netherlands, and 2/3 of our nation is subsiding into the North Sea, with also 2/3 of our agricultural production. I think the same counts for Louisiana, New Orleans, here the Sacramento Delta. So maybe it's the type of analysis that you did, but it's also a very important groundwater-related problem, also affecting food production and food safety, because we have now already increasing impact of salt intrusion via groundwater and surface water. So maybe you can comment on that.
Very good point. Thank you. So I should say the data came from the people we work with, which are officials of each country. I didn't actually collect the data, but it turns out that so these are based on the region they looked at. So maybe in the Netherlands they didn't mention it maybe as a major, but it means it was still there. I can't, I don't have the data in front of me, but they might have suggested it as a minor in those regions. But we can't, we are sort of dependent on those data, and our government themselves report those issues. So they might also lower sometimes of the, the constraint that they are facing based on the knowledge they have, or, I don't say that the Dutch delegates didn't do the right work, but maybe they should have been more serious on that one. I personally am very much aware that subsidence is a big problem, and I mean, we put that forward in the report, definitely.
Thank you.
So I have two questions. One is in relationship, like in California now, groundwater tends to be very local. It's not like a really big single aquifer. So you have regulation plan to be very local, yet at the same time, when I listen to a lot of this, it's really more on a national level, which really doesn't work in the United States, but at least on a state level. So really trying to understand that balance between local, regional, state, national in terms of the thinking. And then the other question is, certainly again from the California situation, a lot of the tension is surface water supply versus groundwater usage. And in this whole conversation, you're only looking at the groundwater side. And so I have to admit, when you say, well, just go after demand first, I think for us in California, the conversation is more like, well, can we have more of a conversation about how to improve the supply side? And then it's easier to have a conversation about the demand side because there's a lot of tension going on there. So again, I was just curious where surface water, groundwater supply interactions fed into your thinking.
Thank you. So on the first question, I mean, I definitely agree that, this is a local problem, so it should be tackled locally. We are asked, we work for an international organization to look at the national level as well, and some of the countries we look at are really small. They're smaller than California, so it makes sense for them to look at national level. So we definitely don't say that you should go at a high level for certain types of policy. It turns out that what we found is that some countries have national regulation, but they have also different policies at the regional level. So we think it's probably a better way of looking at things. It's like this little graph that I mentioned with the three colors. We think that, that's what I mentioned, collective action. It's basically also locally specific types of actions. So, I mean, I don't think we contradict that at all. It's just it's how things work in the world is that way. There are some that really take it at the national level, some that go more into regional. On the surface water, this is a good point. Of course, we focus on groundwater here. We didn't forget about surface water. When you look at least at the regional level, we asked quite a few questions on surface water being available, used in different ways, etc. But perhaps we didn't do as much as we could. We did talk in the economic section about surface water groundwater interaction, what we call stream depletion. And Nick Brozovic is a specialist of that, and he talked about what's happening in Nebraska, how they actually manage it in some of the districts in Nebraska. It's very interesting. There's lots of innovation, institutional innovation in Nebraska that I think it's worth looking at. We also were aware that there were some problems in Europe. So, when you look at it in detail, we do have a little bit of that here and there, but it's not the main message because we wanted to focus on groundwater since most people in agriculture work focus on surface water. So that's why we focused on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll move on to our next panelist. Thanks, Guillaume.